Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are going to be tackling a really thought-provoking concept in political philosophy. It's John Rawls' original position.
Oh, yeah,
Have you heard of this?
I have.
So basically it's this thought experiment that tries to help us figure out, what a truly fair and just society would actually look like. And we're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on the original position as our guide today.
Great source.
It's a really great source. I mean, for anyone who's not familiar with it, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is like a super well-respected, peer-reviewed online resource for all things philosophy. So, yeah.
That's a good one.
So imagine you're like tasked with designing a society from scratch, right? Like, how would you even begin to ensure that it's fair? I mean, that is the challenge that John Rawls was trying to take on with his idea of the original position.
Yeah, and it's a really influential concept in political philosophy. It comes from his famous book, A Theory of Justice. And it's basically this thought experiment that he uses to help us figure out what the most just principles for a society would be.
Okay, so we're talking about like the foundations of a just society.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
not like specific laws or policies, but like the core principles
Exactly.
that everything else is built on.
So the idea is that we imagine ourselves in this original position, where we're behind what Rawls calls a veil of ignorance.
Ooh, veil of ignorance. That sounds kind of ominous. What is that?
Yeah, it's a little bit spooky, but basically it means we have to make decisions about how society should be structured without knowing anything about our own place in it.
Okay, so like you don't know your social status, your wealth,
Right.
your race, gender, talents,
Yeah.
even like your personal values.
Exactly. All of that is hidden from you.
Wow, so it's like a total identity reset.
Yeah, you're stripped down to the bare essentials of being a rational person.
Okay, but why would we choose to be ignorant like that? I mean, it sounds kind of counterintuitive.
Right. Well, the idea is that by stripping away all of these personal details, we're forced to think about what would be fair for everyone, not just for ourselves. So it's a way of ensuring impartiality.
I can see how that would be super important when you're trying to design a just society.
Absolutely.
Like, you don't want to just recreate the same inequalities and injustices
Right.
that we already have.
Exactly.
So how does this veil of ignorance connect to the original position?
So in the original position, we're basically in this hypothetical situation where we're all behind the veil of ignorance and we're trying to come up with a social contract, the basic principles that will govern our society.
Oh, okay, so it's like a negotiation. So
Exactly.
we're negotiating from a place of like radical impartiality
Right.
because we don't know who will be in this new society.
Exactly.
So we have to consider what would be fair for everyone.
Exactly. Yeah, and Rawls argues that this is the best way to arrive at principles that are truly just.
Okay, so it's like a thought experiment to test out different principles of justice
Right.
and see which ones would actually hold up
Exactly.
if we were all starting from a position of equality.
Yeah, and it's important to note that Rawls isn't saying that this is how societies are actually formed. It's a thought experiment, a way of getting us to think about justice in a different way.
So it's not like a historical account of how societies came to be.
No, it's more about like a philosophical tool for analyzing the concept of justice.
Got it.
So it's not about like what happened in the past. It's about what should happen in the future.
I see. So it's like a way of setting a standard for how we should think about justice,
Right.
even if we can't perfectly achieve it in the real world.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to get the idea. But I have to admit, it still feels a little bit abstract to me. But how do we actually go about making decisions in this original position? If we don't know anything about ourselves or our values or our interests, it seems like it would be pretty chaotic.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's definitely a challenging thought experiment. But Rawls does give us some guidance. He argues that the parties in the original position are still rational. They're motivated by self-interest, but they also possess what he calls a sense of justice.
Okay, so they're not just like randomly picking principles out of a hat.
No.
They're actually trying to come up with something that makes sense.
Exactly. They're thinking strategically. They're trying to figure out what would be the best outcome for themselves. But they're also aware that they need to create a society of stable and just, because otherwise it's not going to benefit anyone in the long run.
So it's like a balancing act
Right.
between self-interest and a sense of justice.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could work. But even if we assume that everyone in the original position is rational and has a sense of justice, how do we make sure that the principles they come up with are actually fair?
That's where Rawls introduces what he calls the formal constraints of right. These are basically like ground rules for the negotiation process. They ensure that the principles that are chosen meet certain criteria to be considered fair and workable.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's dive into these formal constraints. What are they all about?
Okay, well, first of all, the principles have to be general. They can't be tailored to favor specific individuals or groups.
Right, so no special treatment or exceptions for certain folks.
Exactly. It's about establishing a level playing field. where everyone is subject to the same rules and has
Hmm.
the same opportunities to thrive.
Makes sense.
They also need to be universal, meaning they apply to everyone equally, regardless of their circumstances.
Okay, so no picking and choosing who gets to benefit from these principles.
Right.
It's about fairness for all. What
Exactly.
else?
Rawls also emphasizes ordering, meaning the principles have to be clear and consistent, so they provide a clear way to resolve conflicts and make decisions.
Okay, so no wishy-washy guidelines.
Right, exactly. We need a solid set of rules that everyone can understand and apply fairly.
Got it. What else?
And one of the most crucial constraints, and one that often sparks debate, is publicity.
Publicity. What does that mean in this context?
It means that the principles of justice have to be publicly known and acknowledged by everyone in society.
Okay, so it's not enough for them to be, like, written down somewhere.
Right.
They actually have to be out in the open.
Exactly. Rawls insists that everyone needs to know what the rules are and why they're in place.
Why is that so important?
Well, for one thing, it's about transparency and accountability. If the principles of justice are hidden or secret, then it's easy for people in power to abuse them or to manipulate them to their own advantage.
So publicity acts as a safeguard against corruption.
Exactly.
But it's more than just that, isn't it?
It is.
It's also about respect for persons.
Right.
Like, if we're going to be governed by these principles.
We have a right to know what they are and to understand the reasoning behind them.
So it's about treating people as autonomous agents
Yes.
who are capable of making their own informed decisions.
Exactly.
I like that.
Yeah, it's a really important aspect of Rawls's theory. It shows that he's not just concerned with abstract principles, but also with the way those principles affect real people's lives.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've got these formal constraints of right, which are like the ground rules for choosing principles of justice in the original position. But how do we actually make those choices? Like, how do we decide which principles are the most just?
That's where Rawls introduces the maximin principle.
Okay, maximin principle. Another new term.
Yeah, a bit of a mouthful. But it's actually a pretty simple idea. It basically says that when you're faced with a choice between different options, and you don't know which option will lead to the best outcome, you should choose the option with the best worst-case scenario.
Okay, so it's like a risk-averse approach to decision-making.
Exactly.
You're trying to minimize the potential for harm,
Right.
even if it means sacrificing some potential gains. So how does this apply to the original position?
Well, imagine you're behind the veil of ignorance. You don't know what your place in society will be. So you have to consider the possibility that you could end up in a really bad situation, like you could be poor or sick or discriminated against.
Right, that would be awful.
Exactly. So according to the maximin principle, you should choose the principles of justice. That would make that worst-case scenario as good as possible.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this works. But wouldn't that lead to a really cautious or even like a stagnant society?
That's a common criticism of the maximin principle, but Rawls would argue that it's not about choosing the absolute safest option. It's about finding a balance between minimizing risk and ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to lead a fulfilling life.
Okay, so it's not about creating a utopia where everyone is perfectly equal.
Right.
It's about establishing a foundation of fairness
Me.
that allows everyone to reach their full potential.
Precisely.
I like that. So how does the maximin principle lead us to choose Rawls' principles of justice over other alternatives like utilitarianism?
Well, utilitarianism says that we should aim for the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, which sounds pretty good on the surface.
Yeah, it does.
But it can have some problematic implications, especially when you consider it from the perspective of the original position.
Okay, how so?
Well, imagine a scenario where sacrificing the basic rights of a small minority would lead to a significant increase in happiness for the majority.
Ooh, that gets ethically murky pretty quickly.
Right.
So you're saying utilitarianism could potentially justify some pretty unfair outcomes,
Exactly.
even if they result in a net increase in happiness overall.
Precisely, and that's a risk that rational individuals behind the veil of ignorance would be unwilling to take. They wouldn't want to gamble with their own basic rights and liberties, even if it meant a chance at greater happiness for others.
That makes sense. It's like playing Russian roulette with people's fundamental well-being.
Exactly, you might come out ahead, but you also might end up being the one who gets sacrificed.
Right.
And Rawls argues that his principles of justice, with their emphasis on fairness and individual rights, offer a much more secure and stable foundation for a just society.
So the maximin principle guides us towards a system that prioritizes fairness and security for all,
Right.
even if it means potentially sacrificing some hypothetical gains in overall happiness.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a really important distinction, and it's one of the key reasons why Rawls' theory has been so influential.
Okay, so we've talked about the veil of ignorance, the formal constraints of right, and the maximin principle. These are all really important parts of Rawls' theory of the original position.
Yes, they are.
But I'm curious to know more about, like, what those principles of justice actually are
Okay.
and how they would work in practice.
Sure.
So in the next part of our deep dive, let's explore those principles in more detail.
Sounds good. So Rawls actually lays out two main principles of justice that he thinks would be chosen in the original position.
Okay, two principles.
Yeah, the first one is called the liberty principle.
Okay, the liberty principle, what's that all about?
Basically, it says that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with a similar liberty for others.
So it's like everyone gets the maximum amount of freedom,
Right.
as long as it doesn't infringe on other people's freedom.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance.
Makes sense. What's the second principle?
Okay, so the second principle is actually two parts.
Okay, two parts.
Yeah, it's a bit more complex.
Okay, lay it on me.
So the first part is called the fair equality of opportunity principle.
Okay, fair equality of opportunity. That sounds important.
It is. Basically, it says that social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged and attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity.
Whoa. Okay, that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it's a bit dense.
Can you break it down for me?
Sure. So basically, it's saying that we should allow inequalities, like differences in wealth or income or social status,
Okay.
but only if those inequalities benefit everyone, especially those who are least well off.
So like if someone is super rich,
Right.
it's only okay if their wealth is somehow helping to lift up the poorest members of society.
Exactly. It's about making sure that everyone has a fair chance to succeed, regardless of their background or circumstances.
Okay, and what about that second part, the one about offices and positions being open to all?
Right. So that part is basically saying that everyone should have an equal opportunity to compete for jobs and positions of power, regardless of their social status or background.
So like no discrimination based on race, gender, or anything like that.
Exactly. It's about creating a level playing field.
I like it. So these two principles, the liberty principle and the fair equality of opportunity principle, these are the principles that Rawls thinks would be chosen in the original position,
Yes, that's right.
and they form the basis of his theory of justice as fairness. Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together. But I'm curious to know more about, like, how these principles would actually work in practice.
Sure.
Like, what kind of policies or institutions would we need to have in place
Right.
to make sure that these principles are being upheld?
Okay, well, first of all, we'd need to have a strong system of basic liberties, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly.
Right, the essential freedoms.
Exactly. These are the things that allow people to live autonomous and fulfilling lives.
Makes sense.
We'd also need to have a fair and equitable economic system, one that provides everyone with a decent standard of living and a genuine opportunity to succeed.
So like things like universal health care, affordable housing, quality education.
Exactly. Those are all important parts of a just society.
What else?
We'd also need to make sure that everyone has equal access to opportunities, like education jobs and political participation.
Right, so it's not just about having the freedom to do things.
Right.
It's also about having the resources and the support to actually make those freedoms meaningful.
Exactly. It's about creating a society where everyone has a fair shot.
I like it. So these are some of the practical implications of Rawls' principles of justice.
Yes,
And it sounds like they would require some pretty significant changes
they would.
to the way our society is currently structured.
Absolutely. Rawls is not afraid to challenge the status quo.
But I think that's what makes his theory so compelling.
I agree.
It's a vision of a truly just society.
Yes.
One that is based on fairness, equality, and respect for all persons.
Exactly.
So it's not just an academic exercise.
No.
It's a call to action.
And is.
A challenge to create a better world.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. But I know that Rawls' theory isn't without its critics.
True.
So in the next part of our deep dive, let's explore some of the main objections that have been raised against the original position.
Sounds good.
So I know that Rawls' original position has been super influential, but it's also been pretty controversial, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Like, what are some of the main criticisms that people have raised against it?
Well, one common one is that the whole idea of the veil of ignorance is just too unrealistic.
Okay, too unrealistic, how so?
Well, critics argue that it's impossible for us to completely detach ourselves from our own personal identities and biases.
Right, like we can't just pretend that we don't know who we are or what we care about.
Exactly, and they say that this makes the original position kind of a useless thought experiment.
Like it's too abstract.
Right, it doesn't really tell us anything about how to achieve justice in the real world.
So it's like saying that the original position is a nice idea in theory, but it's not very practical.
Exactly.
What are some other criticisms?
Another common one is that Rawls' principles of justice are too egalitarian.
Okay, too egalitarian. What does that mean?
Well, critics argue that Rawls' principles don't sufficiently reward individual effort or talent.
So they're worried that a society based on Rawls' principles would be kind of like a leveling down.
Right, they think it would discourage people from striving for excellence.
Because why bother working hard if you're not going to be rewarded for it?
Exactly.
That's an interesting point. So it's like the classic debate between equality and meritocracy.
Right,
Like, how do you balance the need for fairness with the need to incentivize people to achieve their full potential?
exactly. It's a tough question, and there's no easy answer.
Are there any other major criticisms?
Yeah, there are a few others. Some people argue that Rawls' theory is too individualistic.
Okay, too individualistic. How so?
Well, they see that Rawls focuses too much on individual rights and not enough on communal values or the common good.
So they're worried that a society based on Rawls's principles would be kind of atomistic.
Right, like a bunch of individuals pursuing their own self-interest without any sense of shared purpose or solidarity.
That's an interesting critique. It seems like there's a tension there between individual rights and the common good.
Definitely, and it's something that any theory of justice has to grapple with.
For sure. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the basics of Rawls' theory of the original position. We've looked at his two principles of justice. And we've considered some of the main criticisms that have been raised against his theory.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting discussion.
I agree. It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too.
And I think it's important to remember that even if we don't agree with everything Rawls says, his theory is still incredibly valuable.
I agree.
It forces us to think critically about what a just society would look like. And it challenges us to consider the needs of all members of society, not just those who are like us.
Absolutely.
So on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into John Rawls's original position. I hope you found it as thought-provoking as I did.
Thanks for having me.
And be sure to check back next week for another deep dive into the world of ideas. Until then, keep those mental gears turning.